What's up, everybody? Welcome to another edition of the Free Toaster News Pod. I'm your host, Carlos Caro. I'm here with Toaster co-founder Nick Madrid. Before we get to today's story, I want to couple just announcements. One, just usual thank you to our sponsors, Fintel Connect, Spinwheel, and Bulldog Media Group. Second is we've finally released all the details for our event for September 23rd. I'm super pumped that it's out there. Check them out at events.thefreetoaster.com. You can register, you can hold your seat. It's all ready to go. We're really excited to hear from you. So with that, let's jump into today's story. We're breaking down what I think are the early innings of a massive shift in how financial products are discovered. OpenAI just recently launched a personal finance experience inside ChatGPT, and Perplexity did something similar about a month ago. 200 million people already go to ChatGPT every month to ask financial questions. And the big change here is the integration with Plaid. So previously you showed up to ChatGPT and you asked for financial advice, and you'd get a bunch of questions loaded with assumptions or maybe a bunch of questions. So generally it was abstract and not personalized. Now for pro tier users, and the pro tier I think is in the $100 to $200 range per month, Plaid is fully integrated. ChatGPT gets read access to your actual balances, transactions, investments, liabilities, anything you choose to share.
Yeah. So what's so interesting here is, someone who worked at Chime was very always thought about consumer acquisition. What's interesting here is these answers from ChatGPT are they now based on like real financial data, given that it's connected to Plaid? Like that's just a massive unlock,
No,
isn't
that's
it?
exactly it. And users are going to get a financial dashboard, the ability to ask freeform questions, get personalized product recommendations built on their specific profile. So Perplexity built the same thing with Plaid, and they also layered in a bunch of investment grade data from places like FactSet, Coinbase. So these platforms are realizing the power of answering these questions they're getting anyways from consumers, and the ultra specific and not just the abstract. So to me, this feels like a huge acquisition funnel opening up. Intuit plays a major role here. So back in November 2025, they announced a new $100 million multi-year contract to accelerate its AI-driven, what they call their expert platform strategy. So now we're seeing TurboTax, Credit Karma, QuickBooks, MailChimp, all living directly inside the ChatGPT experience. Intuit's leadership essentially said they don't care if a customer comes directly to them or if it meets them inside another app like ChatGPT. And from OpenAI's perspective, Credit Karma brings something really interesting and valuable to the table. They bring their approval odds models.
So let's just like stop right there. And clearly, I think you have a very deep understanding of those um, credit cards models, but just like any model in general from other model providers, and that's such a crucial point. I think for the listeners, these approval models is the ability to tell a user how likely they are to get approved for a specific car, loan, mortgage based on real credit profiles. I think many of our audience would know that, maybe some not. You and I initially met at Caribou, which is all about auto refinance loans, and then clearly the credit card space as well. What's interesting is that Credit Karma has roughly 2 decades, right, of data infrastructure across more than 130 million members to make those predictions. I can't help but think like that is something big. What do you think?
Yeah, no, and Nick, I actually bumped into Credit Karma's page. They're actually reporting 140 million members now, so that number keeps rising. But yeah, look, to your question, when you combine their approval odds data with Plaid, the use case is really, really clear. It's compelling. So like just to give an example, imagine a user shows up and asks ChatGPT about their credit card spend. GPT is going to review their spending through the Plaid link, and they might find the user spent $8,000 last year on, say, United flights. Then GPT could surface the United card, check the approval odds specifically for them through Credit Karma's integration, and then prompt the user to apply. All this could happen without opening a new tab or going to search results page. So it's product discovery, validation of an underwriting match, and a conversion funnel potentially all happening in just like a few keystrokes. So this raises a question to me, at least, of who wins and who loses in this new world. So if I'm running a traditional content affiliate site, I would be very concerned. So specifically sites that rank for terms like best travel credit cards, something like that. They're going to serve a generic display ad and then only collect fees and commissions when a user clicks through and applies. But that static page couldn't possibly know that that user spent $8,000 last year on United on a different credit card. But ChatGPT would obviously know that, and it could tell you exactly how many incremental points you could earn by moving your spend.
Yeah, and if we try to like contextualize this, we've talked about NerdWall before as an example. They clearly are, one of the market leaders in content. But I think the reality is that we spoke about this in the last news pod last week. But OpenAI, I would beg to like they've already consumed all of that public data that's out there, and so what I don't think NerdWallet has, as an example, is they don't have that approval odd model. And they definitely don't have it with the scale and fidelity that someone like a Credit Karma does. And ultimately, when we think about what matters most, it's like consumers and consumers' choice, and they're going to chase convenience. They're going to chase utility. I see myself already preferring LLMs. I'm sure many of our listeners already do anyway. So it's like, I think it's clear where the consumers are going to go. It's just a matter of who's going to be there to serve them right.
Yeah, no, I mean, to me, I'm calling this is kind of the emergence of like a personal finance super app. That's what I think is going on here. So you're marrying the utility of an advisor that has all the context of Plaid's transaction data. And again, that could be bank, deposit, savings, brokerage. That could be almost any financial institution. The certainty you get from Credit Karma's approval odds. So when a product's proposed is suggested, it's not in the abstract. It's, hey, we've checked with the leading provider of approval odds that we think you're going to get this, or potentially with the bank, and we'll get to that later in a second, Nick. But and then you're marrying that with the intelligence of like OpenAI's foundation model. So like that feels like a combination that's really hard to beat from just like a core technology perspective. That traditional pile of blue links on Google's in a lot of trouble.
But in your mind, like, what does this competitive landscape look like, right? So like Credit Karma is obviously, in a very privileged, I would say, very strong position. They might be positioned to be the largest approval odd provider for the ChatGPT ecosystem. But like, and I think, you and I were talking about this earlier, even on Tuesday for the piece, like OpenAI probably has no incentive to try to replicate that in-house. There is this idea that LLMs and frontier models are just going to consume everything and everything is be embedded within the model. But I can't help but think something as nuanced and detailed as credit card approval models across any n number of lenders, that's not going to be done in-house. And so like what's going to happen? So what does that competitive landscape look like? Building credit bureau relationships probably matters and is probably happening already. Try to predict the approval odds, could take decades of infrastructure work. What about the lenders themselves? Like, do we see a world, or can we foresee, get your crystal ball out, like where OpenAI does deals with at least the big lenders directly and like almost bypass some of these, affiliate marketplaces?
Yeah, no, it's interesting because I've been putting myself in OpenAI's shoes and asking myself, hey, what would I be doing as I build like the rails for this personal finance super app? And a couple things I noticed. So one is you're probably not going to go to the bureaus directly. The bureaus just they're not in the business of providing approval odds. That's not something I've seen them do. The exception here is Experian, which is worth talking about. And the reason they're an exception is because they've built their own consumer marketplace for credit cards, personal loans, even insurance products. So they've already built for their own marketplace the ability to drive approval odds. So I actually think Experian's a really interesting alternative if you're OpenAI and you're contemplating, do I go all in with Karma or do I hedge? Do I take multiple sources of approval odds? Experian's very compelling because they own the core data, the credit bureau data, and they own the modeling. Versus on Karma's side, they own the modeling and they have more scale of users than Experian, but the bureau data is a partnership, which, could, while the odds may be low, there's no guarantee that the bureaus would necessarily work with Karma forever, right? Those are partnerships that have to be negotiated on some periodic basis. So I think there's just some interesting dynamics that OpenAI has to think about. And then there's the lenders themselves, right? So if you think about the consumer side of this, um, and I go to ChatGPT, I don't want ChatGPT to tell me, "Hey, you have a really good shot at getting this card." Like, what am I supposed to do with that? A really good shot, okay, but I'd rather be told you will 100% get this because you've plugged in Plaid and because you've given me your username and password to either your bank or Credit Karma. I can tell you with 100% certainty. So um, that to me is the thing. These marketplaces can't guarantee it with 100% certainty right now. So that to me is the interesting opening for the banks themselves.
And it wasn't clear to me until talking to you, like why that's the case. Like why something like a model provider, whether it's Experian or whether it's Credit Karma or SoFi, what does it have? Lantern, Moneyline has Engine. Like there's a couple of them, right? Like why can't they? Like what's the next layer under the hood? Why can't they deliver an approval with 100% certainty? Like I believe it's because they're just trying to normalize models across many different lenders and just any kind of normalization exercise. Like I have deep Bloomberg roots, spent almost 10 years there, just normalizing unstructured data sets. And I understand some of the trade-offs you have to make, but maybe you can give us a little color of like, is that the core problem why they can't return 100% approval rate, or is there something else at play?
That's right, Nick. That's part of it. So the marketplaces like Karma and Experian, in some cases are they're doing inference. So they've seen who's applied and who's been approved, and they're inferring your odds based on like their historical record. So that's an inference rather than like a deterministic process. But Experian and Karma now through their Lightbox and their Activate platforms can actually get a lender to deterministically tell them their criteria. So and for the banks willing to participate with those marketplaces in that model, those two entities do have like a really deterministic rule set. But the issue, even with when they have the deterministic rule set, is there's slightly different data they're running on their end than the bank would run. So the credit bureau attributes are slightly different. The APIs that the marketplaces use to talk to the bureaus are slightly different. So the timing and when they pull the data, all these are little nuanced subtleties. But if a lender like Capital One or Wells Fargo built a direct integration with OpenAI, they could theoretically deliver 100% certainty. So they would own their own underwriting models with their own decision data in the background. That's the change.
Yeah, and I think that's a subtle but pretty incredible difference and an important difference in consumer lending. This idea about like ChatGPT saying, one, your chances are really great versus ChatGPT saying, you know what, I can 100% guarantee that you are going to get this card.
Yeah, and if you're a bank, you might want to bypass Credit Karma or Experian or any marketplace or any aggregator of approval odds, because anytime Credit Karma feeds a recommendation into ChatGPT and the consumer takes it, the lender may have to pay Credit Karma a bounty for that lead. Versus if a bank goes directly to OpenAI and says, "Hey, I can give you absolute certainty on approvals for my products," OpenAI might prefer that direct signal because it makes their product better and more reliable for the user.
So yeah, OpenAI will ultimately have to arbitrate whose signal it trusts most, right? And so like maybe it becomes an infrastructure race between institutions trying to plug in their proprietary data into these LLMs. Meanwhile, like I have to ask, like, what distribution channels actually survive this disruption?
Yeah, so a few channels remain insulated. I think direct mail, it's offline. The AI models aren't going to control what envelopes land in your physical mailbox anytime soon. So that feels like a reliable channel.
What about like social media, right? So like I think about like how that seems structurally separate from all these other channels that we've been talking about. I don't, but people go to TikTok. The kids go to TikTok. I do go to Instagram or Instagram to decompress, right? Or to be entertained or to learn something new. And so I can't imagine that they do not typically go there to ask deep personal financial questions, yet like you still absorb information there. So like I have to imagine like social is still a channel that's going to be pretty robust for the foreseeable future.
Social media has they get top of funnel attention for sure, but there's a structural issue there for financial products. So approval rates tend to be lower because Meta, TikTok, Instagram, these platforms don't have credit bureau based targeting at the top of the funnel. So other owned media, channels like podcasts, YouTube, out of home advertising, they'll also stay powerful for brand messaging, but they're just tough as direct response channels.
Okay, so let's just state the obvious. So, but Google-based search intent is the slice of attention that maps almost perfectly into what ChatGPT, Claude, Perplexity are racing to capture. I mean, that's the vulnerability there.
You know, I think that's it. It looks like we're in the early days of the LLMs constructing, stitching together this personal finance super app. It's going to accumulate context across your cards, your deposit accounts, your saving accounts. It's going to use all of that to inform every single question you ask.
I mean, what's interesting there is that, because people will arm these apps and they're going to get more comfortable arming these apps with personal context, their financial goals, their lifestyle preferences. You know, there could be a world where these super apps are going to deliver proactive advice that create massive utility for the individual. And then now we're looking at a classic data-led product flywheel that just I get kind of excited about. So.
No, that's all. No, that's exactly right. So ChatGPT is going to get smarter and more useful as you connect more data. So the smarter recommendations are going to build more trust and then attract more users. And then that higher level of trust and higher volume of users is going to unlock even more data. And they already have 200 million monthly active users. I mean, that flywheel is already spinning really fast.
But let's connect it back to like why we're actually talking about it this week. Like, I think the underlying story that we kind of hung our hat on was that like Plaid being in ChatGPT unlocks that transaction layer. It unlocks that personal context. So, Credit Karma or Experian plugs into the approval odds layer. Those are foundational pieces. And moving forward, we still need to solve for fraud, identity, and transaction processing at scale, to fully utilize this LLM surface for personal finance. But the building blocks are there.
No, I mean, you nailed it. And the organizations that recognize this trend and figure out how to build a business owning a layer inside these LLM super apps are going to just keep compounding advantage over time for the same reason we talked about, that same data flywheel. So those who wait to see how this is going to play out might be left fighting over whatever consumer attention doesn't migrate over to the LLMs.
Okay, so help me understand. So, like the question every consumer lender who we're trying to target, and shameless plug, trying to get at our event in September 23rd, publishers and lenders. What are the questions that they need to be asking right now? I think it's pretty simple, right? It's like, do you have the proprietary data, a differentiated model asset, or product we're plugging into personal finance super apps a la ChatGPTs? Or do you have the ability to create this super app yourself, which historically, I think many companies have tried to build a super app. It works in regions like Asia. It's extremely hard to do in the US, but like you can still ask that question. Like, can you or should you try to create a super app yourself?
Yeah, no, I mean it's that last question you asked around should you create it yourself that really is striking to me. I don't think it's a given that OpenAI or Perplexity or Anthropic or any of these big kind of foundational model companies are going to win the consumer's trust in the specific niche of personal finance. We still don't know how many people are actually willing to hand over their bank account credentials to ChatGPT. I mean, that's a really big wild card, Nick.
I have a feeling we're going to be tracking this story very closely on the Toaster Media side. I have a feeling we're going to bring this conversation in real life in September 23rd. And I think that remains the big unknown. So I think we're just going to have to update our priors every month until we get to September and even beyond that. But how consumers answer that question over the next 12 to 24 months, that's going to completely reshape the landscape of consumer lending marketplaces. As always, Carlos, like I don't think I always say it, but thanks for breaking this down for at least me. And I know some of our listeners too. Like, I think we learn a lot every time we do this.
Yeah, no, this was super fun. The headline initially didn't strike me as all that interesting, Nick. It was like, okay, Plaid's partnering with. I remember we had this conversation even before we wrote the piece that went out this morning. You asked me, hey, is this thing a big deal? Like Plaid integrating with OpenAI? I'm like, dude, Plaid wants to integrate with everybody. Like, I don't think Plaid integrating with another financial entity is headline news. That's like their core business. They do that all the time. But then as I started thinking about it, and I noticed the the whole super app concept, and you connected it to Credit Karma and the approval. There's a bigger story there. So this one was actually really fun to think about and kind of break down in the newsletter and in this conversation, Nick. So this was super fun. I think we'll continue to write about this theme, like you said, probably for the next year or two. If you're not on our newsletter and would like to be, check us out at thefreetoaster.com. We publish either a curated list of news from the industry every single Wednesday, or sometimes we just pick one story like what we did today and we break it down in a little bit more detail. But this one was a lot of fun and I enjoyed talking through it, Nick.
Thanks, guys.
All right, we'll see you next week.